Good evening. I'm David Ferriero, the Archivist of the United States, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to the National Archives in the William G. McGowan Theater. Tonight, we'll examine the current and future state of film preservation. We'll learn how archival institutions and the film industry are dealing with the digital dilemma as they face the challenge of preserving and restoring our motion picture history. Tonight's program also gives us the opportunity to feature the film preservation and restoration work we do here at the National Archives, and I'm pleased that staff members Dan Rooney, Chris Kovac, Bryce Lowe are here to explain their work and show some examples. We're also very honored to welcome Joe Lindner, Preservation Officer with the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences, who will tell us about the important work that the Academy does in this field. And I'd also like to welcome any members of the audience who were attendees at today's NARA's 26th Annual Preservation Conference. Thanks for sticking with us. Tonight's program is the third of three programs we present annually in partnership with the Academy. It is a valuable partnership that could not have happened or be sustained without the help and support of the Foundation for the National Archives and the Charles Guggenheim Center for the Documentary Film. On February 20th, we'll present the first AMPAS Partnership Program for 2013, the 9th annual 5-day showcase of Oscar-nominated documentaries and short subjects. This is shown the week before the Oscars are presented, so it's a great opportunity to see all the nominees before the award ceremony. Before we get to today's program, I'd like to tell you about two upcoming programs here in the McGowan Theater. Author William Starr will discuss his book, Seward, Lincoln's Indispensable Man, which sheds new light on Lincoln's Secretary of State and the man who oversaw the purchase of Alaska from the Russians. And for those of you who don't know, there's actually a check upstairs in this building drawn on the Riggs Bank here in Washington for $7.2 million for the purchase of Alaska. We actually have the check. The moderator for tonight's program is Dan Rooney. Dan is the Supervisory Archivist of the Motion Picture Sound and Video Branch in the Special Media Archives Services Division of the National Archives. His business card is about that long. He joined the archives in 2002, and since then has worked as an archivist in the Special Media Division in multiple roles, primarily in both the still and motion picture holdings. He attended Loyola University, Chicago, and the Catholic University of America, where he earned his master's degree in library and information science, concentrating on archives and media studies. Now I'll turn the program over to Dan Rooney.
Well, good evening, everybody, and thank you very much, Mr. Ferriero. I'd also like to welcome you all to the National Archives and to the McGowan Theater for our program tonight on motion picture film preservation and the changes and the challenges that we face in the digital age. Here at the National Archives, of course, we have one of the country's largest motion picture collections, and for more than 75 years now, we've had a division specifically dedicated to the acquisition and preservation of motion pictures. In fact, some of the earliest accessioning activity, dating all the way back to the beginning of the archives in 1934, included early U.S. government film operations, films coming into the archives related to those roles. My role now as the supervisory archivist includes overall collection management, public access, and preservation responsibilities for the motion picture holdings. And I have to say that it's been my real privilege the last few years to serve the collection's needs, working in very close partnership with my colleague on the stage here tonight, Chris Kovac, who heads our Motion Picture Preservation Lab. And together, I think our organizations have sought to continue the tradition of our predecessors by firmly upholding NARA's role in and commitment to preservation of our national motion picture heritage. So thanks, Chris. The archive's film preservation approach has relied for many years on an essential strategy of film-to-film duplication, utilizing traditional photochemical printing and processing methods in order to ensure long-term preservation of the holdings. However, like the rest of the profession, we now find ourselves squarely at a crossroads. Market trends, including the significant decrease in commercial manufacture of film stock, reduced availability of media expertise, and equipment obsolescence are only but a few factors which have moved us to explore the future of digital preservation methodology in recent years. About 5 years ago, the archives began making heavy investments into new digital technology, scanning equipment, and supporting data networks to begin what was called an analog to digital transition phase for our preservation labs. 5 years later now, we are very much in a hybrid approach. We're still relying on traditional film printing, but we are embracing the advantages of digital, particularly to rethink our public access approach to delivering film content. Of course, along the way, we have encountered what our Academy colleagues have termed the digital dilemma and the many aspects associated with it. We are facing serious challenges with the massive data sets generated by widely varied digital production processes, long-term ingest, storage, and retrievability of a vast variety of visual and audio digital assets, hardware and software dependence, storage, media reliability, and lifespan. The Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences has been a leader in our field for many years now, and in publishing their report several years back titled The Digital Dilemma, they began to successfully articulate and document the monumental challenges that lay ahead for film archives in our time today. In light of these common challenges and shared philosophies, the Academy has been a partner to the archives in many aspects relating to film preservation, and we're pleased to welcome as our special guest tonight, Joe Linder, the Academy's Preservation Officer. And I'd like to introduce Joe and ask him to enlighten us on AMPAS's approach to film preservation, asking him how do you see this concept of the digital dilemma, and can you give us an overview and an update on what the Academy is doing to address it?
Yeah, I was holding up this. The Digital Dilemma was a report that was done by the Academy Science and Technology Council. So I'm with the Film Archive, but these are my colleagues just upstairs who did this. This came out a few years ago, and the more recent one, the Digital Dilemma 2. Both of these are available for free downloads at www.oscars.org, of course. I think there's still some paper copies of this if you want. Dan articulated many of the issues really well, so I'll just touch on a few of them. And obviously, I don't have any answer for the digital dilemma, but I can talk about what we try to do to deal with it. And just to summarize, one of I think the key conclusions of this report was that digital preservation in the moving image field is a problem, is a challenge, and it's a challenge that even the large studios, the American film studios, struggle with. And if they're struggling with it, how does a state institution, a federal institution, a private institution, a small library deal with it? And though this came out a couple years ago, and one of the conclusions was the studios are still preserving on film, I know today, this year, there was some news in our field about Fuji stopping production of most of their stocks. The one stock they kept, they announced that they were dedicated to, was the black and white separation stock that the studios are still using to preserve their restorations, and I believe many of their new films. So even at that level, where there's lots of money to go around, and there's a lot of motivation to protect those assets. I mean, that's what they call movies in the studios, the assets, because they're valuable to them, so they don't want to lose them. They still use film as a tool. So that was one of the key takeaways from that, and then this followed up with the idea of independent production and documentary filmmakers, and how if the studios are struggling with it, it's even worse there. So we know from film, I do a lot of work where I research filmmakers that were nominated or won Academy Awards. I end up cold calling or emailing and saying, are you the one who made this film that was nominated in 1979? And a lot of times the people say, yes, that's so great. I think I have a VHS. And we say, oh, well, I mean, do you have a negative? Do you have at least a print? Do you have something on film? And everything from, well, I left it at a lab that closed, or my partner took, we were in a dispute and I never got the materials back, to it might be in my cabin in Maine and I only go there every 6 months, or it's in a box under my bed, and so the next time we talk to them, they say, oh, I haven't opened it in 10 years, and they had sent me the wrong film. It's a Chinese film, and I even contacted the people on the label, and they said, no. I said, you must have got my film, and they said, no, we didn't. So it's hard enough when there's a tangible artifact, and I'll address the thing about film. One of the things that archivists love is that it's, despite its fragility in many ways, as an artifact, it can survive benign neglect very well. That was a term that I like from one of the Digital Dilemma reports, that even just being had that film that had been abandoned in a filmmaker's closet been the right film, we would have had somewhere to start. And that is a challenge, that if it's a hard drive and it's 20 years later, the plastic might be very nice, but whether we'll be able to access the data on it, that's the challenge. And then, of course, the big issue is preservation. Many of you must deal with preservation of digital data, and all of us do, but in the industry, in motion pictures, the challenge is our files are just so big, and our storage needs just dwarf most of what people expect. I mean, our IT department, very well intentioned about a year ago, said, well, yeah, we can give you space on our server. I can give you 1 terabyte. And I said, yeah, okay. And they said, you only need it for a year or two. And I was like, no, if we're talking about something else. The Digital Dilemma defines preservation of digital data for accessible over 100 years. So, you could say that's possible if you have migration. And if you migrate, all of your text documents and all of your family photos every 3 to 5 years when you buy a new laptop, maybe that's not so hard. But when you have terabytes and petabytes worth of data that have to be moved every 3 to 5 years, again, a motion picture studio might have continuous funding and a reason to support that, but most of the nonprofits and government agencies don't always have the luxury of that kind of funding. And so that's the fear, is how will this be sustainable over many generations? The simple answer, and I apologize, this slide has been up here so long, I'll start with moving on. The Academy, of course, just a little bit about us, because I do get asked about this. Yes. Where does our funding come from is one of the first questions. And the Academy is known for the Oscar show, giving out the awards to support excellence in the industry. And so for that, we're promoting the film industry. It's a trade organization. That's not a nonprofit activity. And however, very fortunately, people seem to like watching that show. They tune in, and millions and billions of people watch it. And so we have a very lucrative contract for the broadcast rights, and that funds everything the Academy does, and it's the majority of our funding. So anything beyond producing the show and the operations of the administration goes into the nonprofit activities. So we have a number of foundations. The archive has its own foundation now and is located at the Pickford Center for Motion Picture Studies. So let's see, it'll be on your right, that image on the right. We're in Hollywood in the historic Donley Mutual Broadcasting Studios, which was the first permanent TV studio in LA. Beautiful, thick concrete walls for soundproofing, which meant the building was fantastic we didn't have to retrofit. In Los Angeles, you have to worry about seismic stability and earthquake retrofitting. And also great for temperature and humidity control, those really thick concrete walls. So we've turned those old TV studios where shows like Queen for a Day were filmed or recorded into film vaults. Actually, that large studio right on the corner there is the Linwood Dunn Theater. So there's the lobby of the theater on the bottom left. And you can see we don't, unfortunately, still have the windows with the Cadillacs. Don Lee developed the TV studio to advertise his Cadillac dealership. So that's how, that was the reality in the early years of broadcasting, is one business owned a broadcasting facility. In addition to the Archive Foundation, of course, there's the Library Foundation. The Margaret Herrick Library has millions of still photos, tens of thousands of original posters, drawings of costume designs, and books and scripts and personal papers of filmmakers. I've researched Gregory Peck's collection when we were preserving The Big Country. So we also do scholarships and other grants. And the most recent new foundation that's exciting is the Academy Museum. You may have heard that the announcement was that the museum being built from the ground up is going to be partnered with the LA County Museum of Art. So they'd had the architects, but the new press release was the vision. So these are the two new drawings. It's the historic May Company building, which was a department store on Wilshire Boulevard. It's right next to the Museum of Art. And the interesting part, this is looking north, so this is pretty much preserving the historic part of the building. But in the second photo, this is looking south. And one of the challenges was the building didn't seem really suitable for building a theater, but they've come up with a solution where a less historic addition is going to be replaced with this theater. It may be hard to see in this drawing, but I was kind of intrigued when they told me about it. The vision, and again, this is just a vision, this isn't a final drawing or budget, of course, is to have a theater that will be suspended. So there'll be space underneath it for an outdoor courtyard, taking advantage of the Southern California weather. So you can sit out in the cafe. And then above it, you can walk above it, and actually on the deck, you'll be able to look north into the Hollywood Hills and see the Hollywood sign. And it's less clear here, but if you go on our website, I think it's clear on that image. Then the theater itself is also encased in a glass dome, so you'll be somehow having a window to Hollywood. You'll be looking out through that. And the theater itself is in between there, and will be set up for archival film projection. So we have a number of theaters of our own that can show film, but this will be a venue for people who come to the city and then are interested in movie history, and we can, they're eager for that kind of content. We'll be able to present our preserved films there as well. So in addressing, sorry, now to get after then talking about the Academy, getting back to film preservation, how are we addressing the upcoming problems of the digital dilemma? One of the factors is, as Dan pointed out, is the possibility of the end of film stock, which we hate to ever say we're believe in the death of film. I hope it'll last for a long time. But one of the true realities was that the industry decided to move away from film as a projection format and really mandate that all American theaters have to be on board with digital projection. By January 2013, you won't get prints. That's an economic reality, and I can't blame them for that. But the effect of that will be that Kodak will no longer be selling 6,000 copies of every new release the studios make. They'll be making very few, maybe still for international distribution, and a few specialty things. And the archives really are not a big customer of Kodak's, as much as we'd like to be. We're small. Studios were big, and that gave us an economy of scale. So it really meant film preservation was cheap. That's kind of hard to believe, considering that usually we're so much struggling for funding for it. It's actually very expensive. But compared to what's going to happen if that economy of scale goes away, it is cheap. So we convinced our organization, and I was very glad they came through, to invest in Preserve Now. Let's preserve as much as we can now in 2 years. Let's do 5 years worth of work in 2 years, because in 5 years we may not be doing it at all, and it may be more expensive. So we'll be getting a bargain, because we'll do it all up front. And all the new elements we make now, we can scan later. We'll make new negatives, especially of the most at-risk things that'll be harder to scan. So nitrate. You may be familiar with nitrate film. It was used roughly up to 1950. In addition to potentially deteriorating, like you can see on the right, sticky film, fragile film, especially film from the silent era. This is the stuff that's the oldest and most important artifacts we have, especially since we've lost so much of that cinema already. About 80% is what the estimate of films from before 1930 are gone forever. It's not that they're hard to see or the DVD's out of print. They are lost. So 4/5 of our history from the first 35 years of the birth of a new medium are gone forever. So when we have silent artifacts, whatever we have is pretty precious to us. So the example on the left is a film from 1912, a print of The Girl in the Armchair. You can see the broken perfs, the misaligned splices, the non-standard perforations. It's basically a fragile element. And while you can scan it, there are scanners and people who are familiar with scanning really fragile things. We still have film labs in Los Angeles that can print this really well, and we can make a brand new master negative, and we can make new prints. It looks fantastic, and we have something that we can depend on. That's why archivists like film as a preservation format. These new film elements are really stable. Everyone seems to think polyester film can last 100 years. Kodak often used to say 500 years. No one will be around to get a refund if that's not true, but that's a lot longer than we can hope for, especially when you're thinking of 3 to 5 years for migration. We can put it on the shelf and store it and be confident that you have something that you can rely on for preservation. So nitrate was one of the things we said, we'll make as many new negatives and prints of that. But of course, acetate film is susceptible to the same deterioration. This was a newsreel from Laos. But this gets back to that benign neglect that even though this was stored in the worst possible conditions, humidity and heat of Southeast Asia, when we had it, because it survived, we were able to copy this. We were able to copy this photochemically quite well, despite its, like, I think, well over 2.5% shrinkage, the warping, the spoking you can see. We made a beautiful new negative, and that negative is something we'll be able to scan much easier 20 years from now than we can this element. And then 16 millimeter, in particular, the master elements when they were in multiple rolls. Now, I get too technical, I suppose, but basically in 16, it was even in commercial filmmaking, 2 rolls were used to do the editing, and they were sort of checkerboarded, and then you could do your effects, dissolves, and fades that way much more efficiently. Even in standard commercial cinema, sometimes you had as many as 4 rolls, A, B, C, D rolls, and then if you add in student filmmakers, independent filmmakers, and animators, and especially the experimental types, you had all kinds of crazy things with multiple rolls. And so this is an example of an experimental film from a filmmaker called Bayless Glasscock, where the 4 rolls that are in that first synchronizer are the A, B, C, D rolls of the original element. And what's on top in a 5th synchronizer is a positive copy that's not necessarily good for preservation, but is a reference on how they went together. Now, we can copy these today at film labs where those technicians there were still around when A/B printing was traditional, where it was a common commercial thing. So they've got the experience of, if I say ABC rolls, it's not something you're going to find at every city around the world, but when you do have a lab that knows about it, they can make a new single-strand element, and that gives us some confidence. We've preserved it. All those complicated effects are built in. I was talking at Culpeper to some of my colleagues about scanning AB rolls, and they had a lot of confidence that they could do it, scan it, and put the files together. Part of the problem is when you scan 4 rolls, you have 4 times the data, and part of that, all of those rolls is just blank because the image is on only one of the 4 at any one time. That's been trouble for us when we've been to commercial vendors, digital vendors. At LOC, they said, oh, we can do it. But then it turns out they all had backgrounds in commercial film labs. They were optical printers at Deluxe and all that. So of course, they could do it because they had the direct experience when this type of filmmaking was more common. And our fear is in the 100 years from now, someone picks up these 5 rolls and just will be struggling to put them back together again. If we make a new element now, we have a kind of this is another technical lab term, idiot-proof element. You scan it, there's no questions on it. You don't have to say, was it an over, how do these go together? It's all there, and again, it's the kind of thing I'm sure you guys have felt that when you looking over old elements, you wish someone in the past had just done something and you say, oh, you would have made my life so much easier. So if I'm thinking about it optimistically, what I'm saying is I'm giving a gift to future archivists because they'll have these much better elements for us to use. And of course, 16 is one of those stocks that Kodak is less interested in producing, and so it's one of those more at risk, and we want to do this work now so we can get it in the vault as soon as possible. But we also just wanted to make prints, 35 millimeter prints of movies, and so this is just a list to show you the types of movies, the vast variety of films. Nominated films, almost all of these nominated or significant films, almost all in 35, I think, where we made new prints for our collection. Exhibition is another challenge of the digital era because the studios have done a lot of preservation, but they don't always keep prints anymore in circulation. So if you want to show well, I'm not sure airplane's a good example, but if you want to show, and I think it's on this list, but if you want to show certain types of Hollywood films and you think, oh, the studio must have a print, often they don't. And it's the people who are doing Cinematheque programming at places like this come to the archives and say, do you have a print? Magnolia is the film that everyone wants. That's, not that old of a movie, but there's no good studio print, so we end up loaning our print over and over again. And of course, you can make digital cinema packages that show commercial cinema at a very high quality for projection, but the number of movies in the studio libraries that are available that way is very small, and it's not likely to change anytime soon. And unfortunately, a lot of programmers get told when they ask the studios, just show the DVD. Well, if you're a programmer and you're trying to get audiences to come and sit in a theater and you're just showing them something they could get at home, why are they going to come out? When you can show things at a theatrical quality, how it was seen originally or close to that, then people have a reason to say, yes, I want to come and see movies on the big screen. But if you're just showing, there's this gap. DVD is great because so many movies are available, and yet, there's a lot fewer movies that are available in this format. So that's why we said, again, print stock is cheap now comparatively. Let's make as many prints as we can of these nominees. But we've also been doing preservation, so silent films, really cool things on here like an example of effects reels that Linwood Dunn, the visual effects artist, had from the silent era. He would do lectures where he'd show clips from his films. Most of these were from the sound era, so his silent one has clips of movies that are otherwise lost. Got some animation that's really interesting. The first feature that Mary Philbin was in, she's famous for being the female lead in Phantom of the Opera, the silent Phantom of the Opera. And then we've got a number of other silent features, but this one, the Jetta Goodall film, she's a vamp who was big in the 20s and pretty much forgotten because she ended up suing Cecil B. DeMille to get out of her contract and won in court, and then he basically blackballed her in the industry. So she didn't really make it into the sound era. And this film is just, in Variety's review under genre, where they say Western or thriller, they called it exotic melodrama. And it really is a melodrama, over-the-top melodrama set in the French Foreign Legion, and she's a vamp with a capital V. And we had a print from France with French intertitles that was longer than the print that was in Belgium with Flemish intertitles, and a bit of 16 millimeter from the American release that had an opening that hadn't made it to the European version. So we're going to put all this together. We're copying the nitrate, which was the best picture element we could find. Quality of it was fantastic. And this will be really exciting. I mean, this will be a silent film that you could take someone who's never seen a silent movie to. This was so accessible and such a, it's not a masterpiece, I'm saying, but it is a great piece of genre cinema. So I'll be very excited when we have this available. But also short,
Can I interject and ask
absolutely.
a question, actually?
Oh, absolutely.
Can the additional expense of the wholesale production of prints, how do you justify that with in a time of shrinking budgets and a shrinking amount of film projectors available, as you noted before?
Well, yes.
Not to put you on the spot.
No, for the budgets that we've just made that argument, we said, you give us a preservation budget annually. We are somewhat fortunate that way. We don't have to do fundraising or justify every specific project. And the Academy is very happy to use those funds for it. And we're fortunate in some ways not to be as poor as many other nonprofits. Again, the broadcast gives us some cushioning. Although, again, when there's rating fears or even the networks are struggling, yes, it's true, the money is always a problem, but we had a regular budget. What we said is, this is a temporary increase. We didn't, and it was really about 5 times our regular budget, but we said it's for 2 years because we'd never sell them on give us a lot more money forever. We said this is temporary. The idea was that there was this announcement that in 2 years all the American theaters would have to switch to digital, and we said, we can see this coming. This is on the horizon. This is just a loan of future budgets. Give us the money now because we may not be able to do that work then. So that's how we sold it is, yes, it's a big increase in money, but it's temporary because we're trying to take advantage of the situation now. And if it turns out film is so readily available and cheap for the next 25 years, that'll be fantastic. But at least we cushioned ourselves in case it's not. And then into the idea of prints, yes, that's another flaw, is that projection will be an issue. We're lucky at the Academy. We are dedicated to the theatrical experience, so the administration and the membership really understands the idea of showing film. Even if it is unfortunately going to be in a museum-type setting, it's more and more one of these fewer places that can show it. But we also have a projection staff who's dedicated to collecting the equipment. That's another thing, is that they've got our basement at the Pickford Center is filled with old projectors. Many of them donated from people who don't need them anymore or switched to digital. So yes, that's a good question. If in 100 years there'll be projectors to go around, but we still hope those prints will be a valuable resource. So. And then I have another quick, we were actually fortunate to do our first film festival of all the things we preserved as well. So we're not waiting on showing things, we're starting to show them as soon as possible. We showed some documentaries, like right here, Showman, the Maisels film where Sophia Loren is shown the selling of the film to women by the producer. It's really a fascinating verite documentary. Hadn't been seen before, new 35 millimeter print, so we showed it. And now it's available to be shown again. Live action and animated shorts, other documentaries, just some images for examples, as well as feature films. Kind of random, because this is what we had in the collection, but we've done full preservation on both The Cardinal and Sleuth, our Best Picture nominees and multiple nominees, and the film noir here, New York Confidential, we had the originals on, and a couple of cult features like Spider Baby by Jack Hill and Carnival of Souls. and a really interesting pre-code film by Howard Hughes called Cock of the Air, which had some censor. It was another, typical Howard. Did I say Howard Hawks? I meant to say Howard Hughes, of course. Another Hughes, another Hughesian type film, but it had censorship issues with some of the dialogue, and we're not certain yet, but we're hoping that we may have a pre-censorship version of it. But even so, it's an unseen film from 1932. You may think early sound is kind of boring and static. This has beautiful cinematography with a flowing, moving camera. I'll be very excited when we can bring that to audiences again as well. And then finally, to emphasize our connections with our colleagues here, Kukan, The Battle Cry of China, was one of the first. It was given a special Oscar, the very first documentary to be awarded this way, for documenting the Chinese people's struggle against the Japanese occupation. And again, the idea is many people think these films must be somewhere, especially if they won an Oscar, but this film really seemed to disappear. Nara, our colleagues here, had a very nice copy of it. The trouble, it was only the first 30 minutes, and for some reason it was just an incomplete copy. The film's about 85 minutes, I think. A researcher turned up a second film copy with the cinematographer's family, and it was in really poor condition. I mean, it was 16 millimeter, that the ends, a couple of rolls at the end were curled almost to the point where they were touching each other. But fortunately for the opening of the film, we had the first element here, and for the closing of the film, Color Lab here on the East Coast is a laboratory that's very specialized in replasticizing that kind of poor condition film, and they think they can scan it from that. And had that copy not survived, we'd only have those first 30 minutes. So despite the fact that it was deteriorating, that it was in really bad shape, that it had been neglected, when we did finally find one copy that had survived its benign neglect for preservation all these years, we were able to do something with it, and that's ongoing. But Dan used a great phrase, a hybrid era, that we're in a hybrid era. We're not just printing this directly to film, we're scanning it because it's got a lot of damage from its poor condition. And really, to sort of finish, the dilemma, the part that really is troublesome to me as an archivist is that we have both photochemical and digital as a tool, and we've been in this hybrid era for at least 20 years where archivists have used both. The end of film stock means we may lose one of those tools. So it's not that archivists love film and hate digital. It's that we're losing, the hybrid era gives us a lot of flexibility and a lot of confidence to do what we do. When we lose one of those tools, well, then we're in a whole different era. So I have a few more examples of things. I don't know if I should even go into them. I'm sorry about running time. Like one example of silent films about benign neglect. This is a 1911 film that happened to survive in this very interesting format called 22 millimeter, the Edison home projecting kinetoscope. Edison thought he would corner the market on churches and education and home cinema by producing this system that had 3 rows of film that went down, and then you moved it in the projector and you went back the other way, so the images are backwards in the middle strip, and then down again on the right side. So because we had this copy of this film that was kept really as a show and tell thing, as, oh, look at this goofy format. But as it was, all other copies of this film are gone, so it's otherwise lost. And again, that's another example of the hybrid era. We could probably never preserve this photochemically by optically rephotographing every frame, but if we scan it, it's a real pain, but we were able to scan it, and Hagafilm did the work in Amsterdam. They were able to put it back together again. So because this artifact just happened to survive, despite the fact that it's really non-standard, we were able to save it. And I have a bunch more slides here about another area that we get involved, which is experimental films. I'll just scan through them because they're groovy slides. But we have films of Stan Brakhage, who's probably the most famous experimental filmmaker. When it all came in, it looked like this. This was all of his life's work together. He made 400 films, so these slides were put together by my colleague Mark Toscano. He had to do some research just to finally even find out what was the full filmography so we could tell what was missing. And Stan was interesting in that he used, often they're called experimental, avant-garde films, but artist film is a good term for it because he really was interested in light and using film as a vision, as reflecting the vision in his mind. And he's famous for painting on film. So these are images of the actual finished production. really abstract and colorful things. He would print them multiple times to go from negative to positive and use both the negative and positive in the final film. And sometimes he would just layer the paint on to give this texture to the film. So here's an example of the original 16 painted that way. And this is what the rolls look like as an artifact when you're handling them. Painted 35, a really thickly painted one, and painting over a film that had an image underneath it. So there's another example of that. And he also very closely edited his films, sometimes down to single frame images. And he also really wasn't as concerned about the rough nature of his elements. You can see in this piece right here the splices on every frame. And again, this will be an era of the digital tools. When we scan that, some of these artifacts that artists enjoyed, the texture and the look of film, even though if you're doing what's wrong, what was not commercial, what was not a clean image, digital tools often see that as something to take out. And so you have to be very careful when scanning things like this to say, no, this is supposed to be in there. This is not a defect. Example of a roll that's really heavily edited. Every white line there is a splice. Again, if this was a standard documentary, it would not be nearly as many splices. Sometimes he used colored leader. So again, that would be an issue for scanning. The leader is plastic. When projected, the light would go through it. Then you wonder exactly what it'll be like when we tried to scan it. And sometimes he cut little pieces of film and pasted them in there. That's an example of really intense splicing. Or even used not film, but film tape, and put the artifacts between the tape and rephotographed those. And then spliced sometimes tape and paint to actual film stock, and did these really complicated and intense pieces. And even in 8mm, doing things like taping patterns of paper to the film stock. And of course, he was known for Mothlight is one of his most famous films where he used insects, but we also have these elements of a film called Garden of Earthly Delights where he used plants and other organic materials. He worked for many years with a film lab that knew exactly the look he wanted. So that's one of the things, is that we're still working with that same lab in Colorado. And you do wonder, part of the reason I have this on here is the engagement with the artist, even though Stan is passed on. My colleague had worked with Stan in his films and distribution before that, and has worked closely with Marilyn Brackage. And it's really the engagement with him as an artist that gives him the background to know how to address these things when we're doing preservation on them. As an example of that, and I'll finish up now, Robert Nelson, another filmmaker who just passed away this year, Mark engaged him in a number of conversations on preservation, and this highlighted section says, "Your preservationist," okay, I have to read this. "Film view would likely save more stuff than I would, but I think you should lean more my way a bit and be a bit reckless in your disregard and discarding. I'm not happily Mozart nor Freud, so every turd need not be preserved." This was his attitude as a filmmaker, and even though he's a very successful filmmaker, he did this feature film, which in San Francisco and across the country was a big hit in 1967, and had a filmography of a number of well-known pieces. For many of his films, he went back and re-edited and changed and sometimes just destroyed things because he wasn't happy with them artistically. And Mark's engagement with him wasn't to say, you have to give me, the archivist, control over everything. A lot of filmmakers say, don't show this version, show that version. We tried to say, okay, well, we'd like to preserve that original version so it's not deleted forever. Please, let us save it. If you want us to show your new version, that's fine, but let's save the other version. That'll be an interesting thing in a digital era when filmmakers start to just hit the delete key or can just wipe out a drive like that. What happened is, this is from a screening event in 2006. Later in his life, I think Robert started to reflect on his work, and Mark's engagement with him, when Mark would say, this is a really interesting film, why, I know you're unhappy with it and you think it makes you look naive and childish the way the film you made when you were 19, but it's really important, or I like the original version too. So he did start to reflect on it, but unfortunately, this is what he'd started to do. He'd started to say, well, some of my films are better art pieces than they are films. So that's literally rolls of 16mm painted and turned into, in this case, stools, bar stools, but he also did other kinds of sculptures with them. And then it was too late, but fortunately there was a lot of film he hadn't yet thrown out, or he just didn't even know he had, or he would have thrown out. A couple, he said, I destroyed that. And then Mark would get a call 6 months later, and he said, I found some of this, and I think I may give it to you. And it was because of Mark's engagement with him that he was able to get him not to keep making sculptures out of his old film. An example where the awful backlash was a film. This is a distribution card of the 16 print, and there's the highlighted thing that he made an improved soundtrack. Well, this is what artists do. The way he improved the soundtrack was he just took a razor blade and started scratching it away from one print because he didn't really like the track on there. So he just thought it's better if I just put in a bunch of damage and a bunch of noise. And again, that card meant he only wanted this version to be seen. And at first he said, I want that version to be preserved. And we said, okay, well, I know in 1997 you took a razor blade to a film and thought it was a better version, but can't we preserve the original one as well? And eventually he did see that, and he was okay with that. Yes, and again, I think at the end of his life, even though we've lost him, he was very glad to see that people were appreciating his films again. I think that was part of it as well. We were showing the films, and he started to feel like he was not so interested in destroying his old pieces. And my colleague Mark Toscano put this together, so thank you to him. I've talked a lot, so I'll finish up. I do realize that I forgot to say one thing at the beginning. I've talked about film preservation, but there is this idea, this ticking, that we're aiming for this 2 years. If we can keep doing it after that, I'm fine. But obviously, we know we'll have to move to digital preservation in the future. We get digital films now. But the storage was an issue. It's not something you can build on your own. I asked Chris before what she has, and obviously it's a challenge for all of us. We don't have a Culpeper Center like Library of Congress to put all our big files in. We had to partner with the University of Southern California, USC, their digital depository. They have all the Shoah Foundation interviews, so they have thousands of hours of very significant interviews. They've been digitizing them for storage. They've got the experience to do the preservation on it. So we're going to be partnering with them, and after a study to figure out our most at-risk and most important digital elements, our first year, we're putting 97 terabytes into that storage. That's just a fraction of everything we had. It's just a few of our digital restorations. We've only done a few. If we start doing more, those will grow. If we start receiving bigger files from the studios, if we start digitizing the film we have in our collection, even for access, that 97 terabytes is, like I said, just the beginning of it. So that's, if you asked about the digital dilemma, that's the challenge, is we can still make this film now, but when we really can't make film at all, then that's when things are going to change.
It sounds like our two institutions are very much in similar places in many ways. We have also only embarked on, here at the National Archives, we've only embarked on a very small handful of true scanning and restoration projects. And it's actually a nice segue into introducing my archives colleagues here tonight. And they're going to actually show us some examples of some of the archive's early efforts in this area with some of our new scanning equipment and learning about using digital tools to achieve the same preservation means that we've been achieving for a long time now. In a few minutes, we're going to see some examples of 3 different films from the National Archives holdings. One is a brief clip from an Ava Braun home movie reel. And then there are 2 clips from 2 U.S. Army films. The first titled "Let There Be Light," which many of you may have heard of. That's John Huston's 1946 post-World War II documentary on the effects of post-traumatic stress disorder on GIs that were returning home from all the different theaters of war. The second one is titled "The Negro Soldier," which is a 1944 Army documentary, a tribute of sorts to the contributions of African American soldiers in all of the roles they played in all of American armed conflicts up to that point, and also used as a education and I guess to a lesser extent a recruitment tool. But before we see these clips, I'd like to introduce 2 of my colleagues here, Chris Kovac and Bryce Lowe, 2 of our resident motion picture preservation specialists here at the National Archives. And I'd like to start with Chris and ask her if she'd be willing to talk a little bit about the work of the National Archives Preservation Lab and ask her about the digital dilemma and how she sees this challenge for the archives and what it has done to our lab workflow.
First of all, I kind of wanted to give you sort of a brief overview of what our lab entails. The film preservation has sort of been going on since the 50s, when there was a small lab actually housed in this building. At that point in time, it was mainly a reformatting lab and providing theater copies, those sorts of things. We've grown and evolved, now becoming primarily preservation, and we have three main areas of expertise. There's what we refer to as the taxonomic identification process. So we're assisting the archival unit in determining which actual physical copies of each title that comes to us we're supposed to be holding. There are very large accessions that come to us, such as the Defense Visual Information Center collection, which the first shipment came in 6 semi-trucks. So it's taken us the past 6 years to go through and actually determine, what we should be keeping the holdings. For a preservation copy, an intermediate access copy, and something we can serve in the research room. Another large collection that just got dropped on our doorstep is from the Park Service, and I'm not sure how many semi-trucks that was, but you get the idea. There are semi-trucks pulling up to the archives on a regular basis. And there's also NASA, which, yeah, there's
NASA is
there's space shuttle-sized
Yes.
semi-trucks pulling up to the archives. So that is one of our main roles. Also, the preservation of the collection. So preservation needs as identified when people are coming across problems in the archival unit or in the field. And then we also are helping to provide access through research or through reference requests, and then for screenings and that sort of thing. We are primarily a photochemical preservation lab. Our philosophy is that as long as we can preserve on film stock, we will preserve on film stock. Our equipment ranges from printers that were made in the 30s to modern printers to our scanner that we just purchased a handful of years ago. We've got a scanner that we purchased for creating reference and access copies just about a year ago. So there's a continued investment in equipment, even though we love our printer from the 30s. There are 6 of us in the film preservation lab, and our goal each year is to inspect 3.5 million feet of film. We regularly exceed that goal, and just to give you an idea, that's about 4,400 reels of film each year. At some point, a handful of years ago, I tried to estimate how long it would take us to get through the film collection at that rate, and in 296 years from now, we will have touched everything once. So we've got our work cut out for us.
By the way, the Archives film collection is estimated to be over 360,000 unique reels and equating to roughly 145 million linear feet of film.
So
It's all meaningless.
right. So we're going to need a lot of exabytes of storage at some point. But some of the projects that we've been working on recently are, as I mentioned, the Defense Visual Information Center collection. There's a few years ago, we wrapped up the WRS rescue project. This was a film lab that was located in Pennsylvania. They shut their doors one day and walked away with all of our stuff inside of it.
Everyone's stuff.
Everyone's stuff.
Studios,
Yeah.
archives.
Yes, all of the above. And so Dan and a couple of his colleagues went up and crawled around in the dark with flashlights trying to identify our materials. And we spent about 3 years in the process of getting those films back and doing preservation and identification on them. A couple years ago, we finished up the Universal Newsreel project, where we were preserving all of NARA's Universal Newsreel collection, so creating preservation elements as well as access copies. And that was 5,960 original reels. So we created 2 copies, one as a preservation backup and one as access for all of those. I had mentioned the reference work that we do. We are currently scanning film to provide reference DVDs and creating files that we keep in-house. And what we refer to not yet as our preservation digitization program, but our high intrinsic value digitization process. And I'll explain a little bit more about that. But I did want to mention that for our traditional workflows, when we're going film to film, we are inspecting and assessing and repairing and doing all of that work to the film before we're creating film-to-film copies. For that process, we are doing gamma and color correction as needed, as part of standard procedures when we're printing. We can also process black and white in-house, and we have a color lab, which Joe mentioned, to process our color film externally. And at that point, it goes through a QC process, and then as long as everything has come out the way it's supposed to, it can be said to be faithfully preserved and saved for 100 to 500 years, depending on who you're listening to.
Can I ask, so you then buy raw stock directly from Kodak?
We do buy raw stock directly from Kodak, and we'll continue to do so as long as they will produce it.
I was going to say, and then as a customer, I mean, I'm not a direct customer because I don't buy the stock. I buy it from private labs. We don't have our own lab. Do they seem to indicate they're willing to? Do you have what's the impression you get as a customer? Like, well, in 2 months, will you still have 35 millimeter print stock? Have they said any?
We haven't gotten any indication from Kodak that they're going to be discontinuing certain things. In fact, they've come up with a couple of new film stocks lately that they've put on the market. One film stock that we use for our intermediate negatives, they have actually sort of recrafted the formula. And so it's changed a bit. So they're still actually putting some...
Yeah, and a new stock that's intended to preserve, it seems like, digital video or a cheaper alternative to making black and white separations, which are expensive. And so they're thinking that there may be a market for that. Have you looked at that one at all?
We haven't yet.
Oh.
It's been pretty new. And I've been on maternity leave, so
Oh, yeah.
the only thing I'm looking at is
I'm
my
just
baby.
curious, yeah.
So
Although the reliability of the ordering is a bit of an issue, is it not?
it can be. One thing that we've noticed is that the main manufacturing plants are, the biggest one is still in Rochester. But we noticed that our film stock is being shipped from a few, cases will come from Indonesia, a few cases will come from Canada, a few cases will come from India. So that makes me feel like we're perhaps on some shaky ground. It's a bit disconcerting. So
I think we're clearly in flux as far as where the market's going to go, because as Joe was mentioning earlier, we all know Kodak's problems, and we all know that Kodak may or may not be around, and the idea was, well, there's always Fuji. Fuji will be there. And it was just, as Joe mentioned earlier, it was just announced in September that beginning March of next year, Fuji is no longer going to be making film stocks, either camera negative, black and white stocks, and they're only going to be making the separation masters. And so if that possibility of a manufacturer is gone, that's great for archival process. But we still have a lot of 16 millimeter, which I think, as Joe mentioned, is really at risk because there's really almost no market for that for exhibition or distribution at all. And so the way I understand what's been kind of being discussed is that Kodak will be continuing to manufacture those stocks that Fuji won't make. So no longer are they going to be competing for the same business. So whether or not that holds true, and I had just read The Digital Dilemma. I know that came out, when did that come out? 2008? 7, somewhere around there? I just reread that this week. And in that report, it was saying that, well, we anticipate film to be around for the next 10 years. It's only been 4 years, and we may be at that point where it's starting. We're almost near the other side of that. And so it's coming on us pretty fast, but I think 16 millimeter is very at risk. And we do a lot of intermediate duplication. So if you're doing preservation photochemical and you have 16 millimeter elements, we may be in trouble here. So not to be a downer at all.
Right.
I was just going to say.
But it's, I mean, that's just kind of where we're at. So.
Yeah. We may end up, trying to stockpile as much as we can.
Yeah.
At some point. So I'm hoping that day is farther off than I think it will be. But
There used to be a bit of optimism in some of the FIAF, which is the International Federation of Film Archives, that, oh, well, when Kodak decides they're not really interested in it, the archives can take it over. The Kodak will be willing to donate their patents because they're so valuable, and then we can keep producing our own film stock. But really, we used to say how film was such a great thing. It was somewhat, it was a transparent format. It was so easy it's the same format from, 1895, 35 millimeter hasn't changed that much. But the manufacturing of film stock is an extremely technical, complicated thing that sure Kodak did well because they made so much of it and they were, had so many years experience on it. But the idea, if they stop and those experts and those machines go away, I again hate to be a downer, but the chance of starting them up again seems almost impossible. I mean, there are cases like that guy who bought the Polaroid technology in Amsterdam and started making new Polaroid. That you can recreate some of that technology, but this is done on an industrial scale and making film stock that's reliable, that doesn't have the flaws and has the exactness of the perforations or all those our specific needs like 16 perforations. That's going to be really hard to replicate if Kodak does stop making stock. So.